Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot of Activists, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today I'm very excited to discuss with you a fascinating topic. To what extent do the languages that we speak shape the way we see the world? That's it. We're going to see what is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, what are the strong and weak versions of this hypothesis, the evidence for the weak version, and the conclusion. So first of all, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis really crystallized in the 1920s. Of course, it didn't come out of the blue. It had some forerunners in Herder and other linguists for which each nation's specific language encoded a whole cultural universe. But it really came to fruition in the 1920s in the US, through the work of both Sapir and Whorf. Now, it's important to say that Sapir and Whorf never produced a joint work, and they never really praised their thoughts about language and reality as a hypothesis per se. So some authors claim that Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a sort of a misnomer. At any rate, the key idea is that people's languages have a significant influence on the way they think and perceive the world. That is what the hypothesis is about. Now, in the famous words of Whorf, users of markedly different grammars are pointed by their grammars toward different types of observations and different evaluations of externally similar acts of observation, and hence are not equivalent as observers, but must arrive at somewhat different views of the world. So here it is. The fact that we have different grammars means that we must arrive at different views of the world. That is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, of course, not all Sapir-Whorfians believe that language influences our perceptions of the world to the same extent. So that's why typically in the literature, we tend to distinguish between the strong and the weak versions of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, even though neither Sapir nor Whorf distinguished between these two versions themselves. So the strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that the language or languages we speak determine the way we think and view the real world. So think, for instance, of George Orwell's 1984, where the idea is that if you lack a word for a certain concept, then you cannot possibly think about that concept. Now, that is, of course, ridiculous. Just because the language or languages you speak lack the word for light blue, it doesn't mean you're unable to think about that shade of blue. So, of course, this strong version was never proved, and it was discarded pretty quickly in the scientific community. And now the weak version, also known as NeoOrphenism because of Whorf, is a bit more realistic and claims that the language or languages we speak have a certain influence on the way we think and view the real world. So it's not that they determine necessarily, that they force us to think and view the world in a certain way, but they have certain influence. And that's the key word, a certain influence. How much influence? In what sense? That is a separate question. Still, the weak version is ambitious. It might not be as strong as the strong version, but it's still very ambitious. So, for instance, a renowned NeoOrphean nowadays is Lara Boradetsky, and she claims that human minds have invented not just one cognitive universe, but 7,000, each for each of the 7,000 languages spoken around the world. So that claim is pretty strong, that each language encapsulates an entire cognitive universe. So let's see what the evidence for the weak version is. What is the evidence on the extent to which people's languages condition the way they think and perceive the world? I have divided this evidence on 6 different topics: space, time, numbers, colors, gender, and event discussion. These are in no particular order of importance. So let's take, for instance, the issue of space. We conceptualize space in body relative directions, also known as egocentric coordinates. So left, right, forwards, backwards, up, and down. However, there is an Aboriginal community in Australia that only uses cardinal directions: north, south, west, and east for everything. So imagine, for instance, that you are presented with 2 hotel rooms where all the elements are the same and they are distributed in space in the same way. If you were to visit both rooms and then to report what the difference was between these 2 rooms, you would say these are the same room. However, if a person from this Aboriginal community visits both rooms and say both rooms are in front of each other, to that person, the spatial orientation of the elements in each of these rooms is the opposite. What is north in one of the rooms is south in another room, etc. So the way they think of the rooms is the opposite, whereas for me, it will be the same because I will be thinking in terms of left, right, up, down, forwards, backwards. As a result, also, this Aboriginal community is better at spatial orientation. They always know where's the north, where's the east, where's the south, and the west, whereas most of us don't really know that. And so the question is, of course, does the language that they have influence the way they process spatial orientation, or does the language just reflect the fact that they orient themselves in a different way? Second topic, time. Some languages, as you know, are written from left to right, for instance, English. Others are written from right to left, such as Hebrew. Speakers of languages that are written from left to right tend to arrange chronological events in a left to right sequence, and vice versa. Speakers of languages that are written from right to left tend to arrange chronological events in a right to left sequence. For instance, if I ask somebody whose first language is English to arrange breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they will probably start by writing breakfast on the left side of the paper, lunch in the middle, and dinner on the right side of the paper. For a person whose first language is Arabic, which is written from right to left, that person is more likely to write breakfast on the right side, lunch in the middle, and dinner on the left side. Now, does that mean that people whose first language is written from left to right lack the ability of arranging chronological events in a right to left order, or vice versa, that people whose first language is a language written from right to left cannot possibly arrange chronological events in a left to right fashion? Of course not, because that will be believing in the strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that if you lack a certain linguistic elements, you're therefore unable to think about the world in a certain way. All it means is that people who are more familiar with languages that are written from left to right are more likely to arrange chronological events in a left to right sequence, and vice versa. So it's not a matter of determining the way you arrange those events, but having an influence on the way you arrange those events. Let's go now with numbers. Some Amazonian tribes people do not have names for exact numbers. They do not have a word for 5 or 42. And a person in this tribe has a harder time learning math, as what the evidence points out too. However, we really have to think hard about what this means, because not having a word for specific numbers, that is to say, not having words to count, is the very definition of not being able to count. So what is the cause and what is the effect? How can these variables be independent? That's what we are trying to elucidate. Is the language predisposing us to not being able to count, or is the fact that we are not able to count reflected in the absence of names for numbers? Presumably, this tribe does not count because, as an isolated tribe of hunter-gatherers, they don't have the same need for number complexity that we have in other environments in the so-called West. So what to me this suggests is not that language affects cognition in a radical way, is that whereas we tend to presuppose that numbers are essential to human languages, they are not. Numbers are accessory as opposed to essential. So again, this evidence is not evidence for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it's evidence for the fact that names for numbers are not a necessity per se in human languages. Now let's discuss evidence about colors. So in Russian, there is no word for just blue. Instead, this language features different words for different shades of blue. It has a certain word for light blue. It has a specific word for dark blue, whereas English necessitates two words, light blue and dark blue, respectively. Now, it is also the case that Russian speakers differentiate shades of blue more quickly than speakers of languages that have a specific word for just blue, but don't have a specific word for a certain shade of blue. What is the difference in cognitive processing? In one experiment, the difference was tested to be 124 milliseconds. So speakers of Russian were 124 milliseconds quicker than speakers of languages that do not have specific words for shades of blue to spot that particular shade of color. Now, some authors have interpreted that this difference is not relevant because it is quantitatively scarce. Just 124 milliseconds, 0.124 seconds, that's nothing. But I don't agree with this conclusion. I believe that just because something is quantitatively small, it doesn't follow necessarily that it's not qualitatively relevant. In 124 milliseconds, your life could be over. By just 124 milliseconds, one could win the gold medal at the Olympics or not even qualify for the podium, and that could change your life. So small quantitative differences may have tremendous qualitative differences. At any rate, the question here is not that. The question is whether people who are faster at differentiating shades of certain colors have therefore an entirely different worldview. I'll let you determine that. Moving on, we have gender. So as you know, in Spanish, for instance, the noun moon is feminine. We say la luna. We don't say el luna, but la luna, feminine, article la. But sun is masculine. We say el sol. We don't say la sol, masculine, article el. In German, the opposite is true. Instead of la luna, you say der Mond, masculine, article der, meaning el luna, if you were to translate that into Spanish literally. Whereas for sun, we use the feminine article. We say die Sonne. So literally la sol, if you were to translate that from German into Spanish. Now, it is also the case that Spanish speakers tend to picture the moon as featuring stereotypically feminine features and the sun as featuring stereotypically masculine traits. For German speakers, the opposite is true. And here the question we ought to ask ourselves is different. It's not so much is the fact that the moon is a feminine noun in Spanish the cause of the fact that Spanish speakers tend to attribute stereotypically feminine characteristics to the moon, or is the fact that they think about the moon stereotypically in feminine terms reflected in the fact that in Spanish the moon is a feminine noun? That kind of speculation wouldn't make much sense. Instead, what I think we ought to reflect upon here is it might as well be the case that in Spanish the moon happens to be feminine and in German it happens to be masculine just because. Does there really have to be a reason why everything is the way it is in a given language? Does there really have to be a reason why prepositions are used in a certain way in English as opposed to the way they're used in Spanish. Everything has to have a reason why in every language. I don't think that is the case. I think that some arrangements in specific language come from mere chance. And finally, event discussion. So, for instance, in English, nouns are not gendered, right? Friend. We use the noun friend to refer to both a male friend or a female friend. If you want to specify the gender of that friend, you have to add a new word. By just saying friend, we won't be able to tell if you're making reference to a male friend or a female friend or something in between. We simply can't tell. But in Spanish, we have gendered nouns. So we say amigo if it's a male friend or amiga if it's a female friend. And it's also the case that Spanish speakers feel a stronger need to think, report, and recall gender characteristics. So for instance, now let's say you are a heterosexual man that is 16 years old and you live with your parents, right? And one day you go out and they ask you, who are you going out with? Now, in English, you can get away with saying, oh, I'm just going out with a friend. They won't be able to tell if you're going out with a male or with a female. Now, compare this with someone from a Spanish-speaking country. Who are you going out with? Well, now you're forced to think, report, and recall the gender characteristics of your company for that night. So you have to say either amigo or amiga. And this can be met with different kind of reactions from your parents. Since you are a heterosexual male, they can ask you, oh, why are you going out with an amiga? Where is she from? Yada, yada, yada. I guess you get the point. Another example is that for the purpose of reporting accidents, in English, the subject is often made explicit. For instance, he broke the glass. I broke my arm. Now, these were accidents. You didn't really intentionally break your arm, unless you're a psychopath or something like that. Presumably, your arm just broke by accident. You didn't intend for your arm to be broken. Still, the grammar of your language is such that it looks as though you were the agent. I broke my arm. Whereas in Spanish, we often utilize impersonal sentences in those contexts. So we would say the equivalent of my arm got broken. Se me rompió el brazo. We use that particle se to make it impersonal. My arm got broken. It literally means that no one is responsible for that. It just happened to be the case that I had an accident and that followed, and my arm broke. So as a result of their respective grammatical arrangements, English speakers experience a stronger need to attribute blame. If you are in a trial, for instance, you might be more inclined, even at a subconscious level, to ascribe blame or to reveal who you think is guilty of a certain action. Whereas in Spanish, you can always deflect, avoid specifying the agent of the action by recurring to the more frequent impersonal construction, which wouldn't come across as contrived because, again, it's just more frequent in Spanish than it is in English. So what is at stake in all these cases? Well, the question to me is this: does language significantly shape reality as contended by NeoOrphians, or does it mostly reflect it as contended amongst others by McWhorter? Well, I think we need to pay attention to three things here. The first one is that chance plays a role. When we are discussing the influence from language to thought, we're already entering a frame where there has to be a cause and an effect. But sometimes in language, it is not about cause and effect. So we need to step back and think, is there really a cause and effect relationship in this linguistic phenomenon, or am I just captive to this causal framework and I cannot possibly see outside of it? So when we discuss the gender of certain nouns, such as the moon and the sun, presumably there is not really a reason why this is the case. This just happens to be the case. When we discuss the way we place prepositions in Swahili, presumably there is not a cosmological reason why this is the case. It just happens to be the case. So not everything is cause and effect. When it is about cause and effect, nonetheless, we need to take into account that language and reality are not independent variables. They are always already connected in a continuum. Nevertheless, they do shape each other. This is why it's so hard to design experiments that can test the influence from language to thought, because it's very difficult to tell them apart. We know there is some kind of influence between both, but we also know that they are part of a continuum in our everyday life. Now, the fact that language has a certain influence on reality and reality has a certain influence on language does not mean that the influence is just as strong or just as weak in both directions. What I think the evidence, or rather the lack of evidence so far from NeoOrphenism points out to, is to the fact that the influence from words to the world is significantly weaker than the way in which the world is reflected in words. So whereas we have the ability to influence the world and our perceptions through words, this ability is rather limited. It is rather the case that our world is in a certain way, and then language serves as an instrument to express, to reflect the way our world is arranged. Again, both phenomena take place, but the influence from the world to language is bigger, is stronger than the influence from words to the world. That is why the evidence on the extent to which our languages reflect the way our worlds are is stronger than the evidence on how the words we use influence our perception of the world. I agree here wholeheartedly with McWhorter when he claims that we hit a snag when we try to go beyond the experiment and embrace the notion that it is telling us something about worldviews, being a human, and the like. These are all exaggerations. There are experiments that show the influence from language to the world, but the weakness of that link does not really justify grandiose conclusions about, oh, this person speaks a different language, therefore his or her worldview is entirely different. So in conclusion, while learning new languages does provide us with new cognitive insights, say for instance in spatial orientation, time orientation, and cultural ideas, how do we count entities, how do we individuate them, etc. While this is true, at the end of the day, the world looks pretty much the same in every language. It's not because a certain Aboriginal tribe in Australia can orient themselves in a different way that their entire universe is qualitatively different from ours. And it doesn't need to be the case for us to appreciate cultural diversity, for us to appreciate the value that learning languages brings to our lives. So I hope you now understand better what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is and its implications. And as always, thanks for watching.